Good morrow, students. Hello, and welcome to one of our introductory videos on William Shakespeare in the classical world. I wanted to make sure before you read Titus Andronicus that we had a brief discussion about Shakespeare's influence, or I should say the way that Shakespeare was influenced by the classical world, and in particular draw out some of the connections between Seneca's Thyestes and Ovid's Metamorphoses, in particular the story of Procne and Philomela, and how that influenced the creation of Titus Andronicus. But to do that, we need to know a little bit more about Shakespeare, a little bit about the way he was educated, and then a little bit more about the way that classics was present in his world. So let's get started. So a very brief background on William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was born right around this time, between April 21st and 26th in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is quite close to London. His father was a wealthy glove maker who later became an alderman, who's a kind of mayor. And the alderman had a responsibility to produce some entertainments for the people of the city. So it's likely that Shakespeare himself had a lot of experience either watching plays as a child, plays that his father would have helped to produce, and maybe even acting in some of them as well. He was likely educated at the Stratford Grammar School, and we'll come back and talk about that in just a moment. But interestingly, even though his father was a man of means, Shakespeare never went on to go to a university like Oxford or Cambridge, which would have been pretty common for a young man both his age and of his father's wealth. But Shakespeare, at the age of 18, got his older girlfriend pregnant. Her name was Anne Hathaway, and she was 26, and they eventually got married and wound up having 3 children together. The eldest was a daughter, and then he had twins, a girl and a boy later on. So Shakespeare never technically got a degree. He never went on to university, but he did begin writing plays early on in the 1590s when he was only not quite 30 years old. One of his earliest plays was Titus Andronicus, which he wrote in 1594. So bear that in mind, this is one of his earliest. He probably started out in the theater world as a script editor and an actor, and then later made his name as a playwright in his own right, but most likely was an actor himself. He did become a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men's Theatre Company. And as you may remember from our other video on Renaissance England theater, this was the company that later would go on to build the Globe Theatre, which was kind of Shakespeare's home theater and his acting troupe's home theater that he eventually made quite famous. So eventually, the Chamberlain's men were kind of bought out and underwritten by the king. So they became the King's Men, and in addition to producing plays at the Globe when the weather was nice, they also moved into Blackfriars, which you'll remember from the other video as well as the indoor theater. When the Globe burnt down, the King's Men elected not to rebuild it. And Shakespeare himself died just a few years later in 1616. So his career was relatively brief in terms of production, but as we know, as inheritors of this tradition, it was quite brilliant. So let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare's education. So I mentioned that he likely attended the Stratford Grammar School, and that would have been a school for middle-class boys. Much like Shakespeare and the wealth that his father's family created. So he was not noble. He did not come from a noble family, but he came from a wealthy family. His father was a merchant. He had a trade and was able to make enough money to keep the family very comfortably. So many of these boys who would, and it was boys only, who would attend school would grow up to be lawyers or clerks, clerics in the Church of England, secretaries to politicians, or politicians themselves, what one scholar called the mainstays of the rapidly expanding Elizabethan state. So boys who graduated from these grammar schools were essentially becoming an intellectual working class almost like an intelligentsia of sorts. They would go on to get their degrees at Oxford or Cambridge and would eventually become the knowledge workers of sorts of the Renaissance. At the school, the curriculum was almost entirely focused on reading works from Roman antiquity. So there was no history, math, or geography, or science as standalone subjects, right? Mostly what you learned was Latin grammar, how to read Latin, and then eventually how to take the knowledge that you were reading from Latin to educate you on other subjects. So some of the exercises they would do would be to take English, or take something in Latin, translate it to English, and then back into Latin, or vice versa. Take something from English, translate it to Latin, and then back into English. Their devotion to learning Latin was such that they even spoke Latin in school as a living language. They didn't speak English at school. And if you'll recall, the Catholic Church still to this day maintains that Latin is its language of choice, its official language. And we have to remember that up through the end of the Renaissance, Latin was the kind of the political language. We think of that as English today, where almost everyone needs to know English to be successful in a global world. But in the Renaissance, it was Latin. You needed to know Latin to be successful. They did learn some of the tenets of ancient rhetoric, how to be a good speaker, a good orator, to be persuasive. But interestingly, they did not have as much exposure to ancient Greek, and that was largely an issue of regionality, interestingly. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE, concentration of power was divided between the West, which was Rome, and the East, which was Constantinople. And while the West began to fade a little bit, the East continued to flourish, and there was a lot of contact with many of the people in Turkey and moving farther east who continued to speak Greek. So the knowledge of Greek and the preservation of Greek and Greek literature was very much focused in Constantinople moving east, whereas the knowledge of Latin and the preservation of Latin was very much focused in the West. So that's just a little bit of an interesting tidbit, but it also explains why only a few very well-educated men knew ancient Greek in Renaissance England. It wasn't something that was taught in schools. So what does that mean for Shakespeare? So we have to imagine that as a young boy, Shakespeare learned how to read Latin pretty well. And he would have read a lot of the Latin texts that his teachers would have given to him. And he would have become well-versed and probably a pretty quick reader and possibly a very deep reader. There's quite a lot of Latin that sort of survived from antiquity, some of the most kind of what we consider to be our canonical works. But we also have to remember that at this time, there was also a resurgence of interest in the art and literature and philosophy of antiquity. And this is what we call the Renaissance in general. And this time in England also saw a flourishing of translations of works from Latin into English. So we have this wonderful sort of perfect storm of conditions where we have a new interest in, or renewed interest in the art and literature from the ancient world. We have an educated class of kind of middle class, upper middle class English people who are looking for education and who have money to spend on education. And we have the printing press. We have a way to create and disseminate many, many, many copies of different works of literature. So these translations became quite popular. So we know from many, many, centuries of scholarship on Shakespeare that he did rely on a couple of different translations of works that eventually became some of his greatest influences in his own plays. But again, we have to imagine that Shakespeare himself was able to read the Latin. So it was probably more comfortable for him to read the English, of course, as it is for us to read things in English, even if we do know a second language. But he had the ability to dive a little bit deeper into some of his Roman readings. So some examples of the books that were of most importance to him. One of them would be Thomas North's translation of Plutarch's Lives from 1579. And this was literally a collection of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans written by Plutarch. But you can see that Shakespeare essentially wrote 4, possibly 5 plays based on the lives of Plutarch, among his most famous being Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. In 1581, 10 tragedies of Seneca were translated into English, and they were translated by a bunch of different college boys at Oxford and Cambridge who really wanted to produce the plays and to perform in those plays at their universities. So among those in 1581 was Titus Andronicus. That was Thyestes, was among those that were translated. And Shakespeare wrote Titus Andronicus in 1594. That's when it was first published, so just about 13 years after that Seneca production, or that Seneca translation came out. By far, well, I don't want to say by far, Plutarch's Lives is pretty influential, but possibly right alongside, or possibly just edging it out just a little bit, would be Ovid's Metamorphoses. The Metamorphoses is the large kind of epic poem of a collection of stories about the ways that the gods transform humans into many different objects over time. And the story of Procne and Philomela that you read for our next class is one of the stories that survives or is included in the Metamorphoses. So in 1567, Arthur Golding created this kind of seminal English translation of the Metamorphoses that we know Shakespeare relied on for several different plays, but among the most famous, obviously, are Titus Andronicus, and then also A Midsummer Night's Dream. Romeo and Juliet is also inspired by the story of Pyramus and Thisbe that comes from the Metamorphoses. That's also included in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And you can just see echoes of these stories throughout. One last one that I'll mention is a comedy, actually, by Plautus, which is called the Menechmi. Menechmi just means the two Menechmuses. It's a story about twin brothers who have a series of unfortunate events related to identity confusion. They're twins and they keep getting confused for each other. So it's possible that the 1595 translation of the Menechmi by William Warner might have inspired Shakespeare to write A Comedy of Errors, which is very much along that same lines, twin brothers who are mistaken for each other, kind of falling into all of these different misadventures. So really what I wanted to outline is that Shakespeare does, in fact, he is a deep reader of the classics. He's very steeped in this tradition, and there were, not only in his own education, but also in his own time, a fair amount of resources available to him that would allow him to dive relatively deeply into the literature that we recognize today as being canonical, especially Latin literature, and of interest to the ancient world. So as we continue on with our discussion of Titus Andronicus, of course, we'll be leaning a little bit more heavily on the story of Procne and Philomela, and we'll be discussing a little bit more in depth how Seneca influenced the way that Shakespeare structured Titus Andronicus. All right, until then, I wish you good eve, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.